Good morning. It's lovely to be here. My name is Shami Chakrabarti. I'm the Director of Liberty. I suspect you know who these eminent gentlemen are, but for the sake of form I will introduce them. To my left, that's geographically, you can draw your own conclusions. We have Sir Keir Starmer QC, who you will know well as the former DPP and now a shadow Home Affairs Minister, and an expert on human rights law. And to my right, again, draw your own conclusions, we have Crispin Blunt, a long-standing Member of Parliament, but now, crucially for these purposes, the Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee that's been quite busy this week. But Syria is not in the Commonwealth, so we don't need to worry about that to today's purposes. Now, I think that the idea is that I'm going to have a pretty informal conversation. I've got a pretty broad canvas to paint on human rights in the Commonwealth. However, I do want to begin with a question, because it's something that has worried me since I saw the documentary India's Daughter. How can it be that the country of my parents' birth, that I was once told was certainly one of the most numerous democracies in the world, is both capable of producing the kinds of scenes that we watch in India's Daughter, and perhaps even more importantly, how is it possible that members of the Indian bar, not in court in defence of their clients, that's one thing, but on camera after the event can sit there and say that the victim, the medical student who was so brutally raped and murdered in that case, deserved it. How is that possible in 2015? Who would like to give me the answer?
I mean, I haven't seen the clip, but Shami has described it to me. I think, just working back up through your questions, as it were, of a lawyer making awful remarks in relation to not really the case, but women and girls in general, and how they should behave, and what is legitimate if they don't behave in the way that he thought acceptable. And from what's been described to me, it is shocking on so many levels. I mean, first, for the pure content, that anybody thinks that way. Secondly, the fact that anybody thinks that way thinks it's perfectly all right to tell the rest of the world. And third, as I understand it, sitting there with robes on as counsel in the case, speaking to the public about his views. And so there are complicated layers there of outrage or discomfort. I mean, I think there is a more, just sticking with the lawyer theme for a while, I think there is a real lack of accountability for lawyers, actually, in all countries of the Commonwealth, including our own. Lawyers are not held to account very often. The behaviour of lawyers in court isn't always what it should be, and not everybody sees that. And what lawyers say outside of court is often seen to be a protected area because they're somehow lawyers. So I think there is quite a big issue here. I mean, one of the things, although it wouldn't have made any difference in this case, that I've always argued for is cameras in court. I think there should be much greater accountability for what goes in court than I would have. But just as we have for Parliament, I'd have cameras running in most of our major courts all the time, so people can actually see the behaviour of individuals. As for the deeper question, which is, in this family we call the Commonwealth, where we think we've got, we think we all understand the story of human rights to be a story where the world came together after the Second World War and sort of stood around in a solemn circle and agreed common standards for the world and signed up to them. Here we are, decades later, with very, very clear examples of those standards simply not having any meaning at all in practical terms in a number of Commonwealth countries. And so it's this massive gap between the sort of comforted world that we like to think we live in and the practical reality on the ground, and that is always going to be the problem, I think. Because what you'll find in these Commonwealth countries is usually entrenched in pretty strong human rights standards. So there's usually very little problem with the supposed legal framework within which all this happens.
But if that's right, Crispin, how does the Indian government get away with banning that documentary? If we're, this is a very friendly nation, great deal of shared history and connection and family and so on with the UK. That documentary is banned in India, and there was an attempt by the Indian government, I believe, to prevent it being aired by the BBC here in the UK, and statements about defaming the nation they use. That doesn't sound like shared values.
No, it doesn't. That I don't understand why they were able, why or how they were able to do it. Because one would have thought that the Indian legal system and the challenge is that are brought within the legal system by human rights defenders and champions of liberty. It may creak pretty slowly, the Indian legal system, but it does sort of creak on a way that we would recognise. So I don't know how they were able to get away with that. But I want to go back to your original question. I'm surprised we were surprised. You've got a cultural context in India about attitudes to women that are, and a religious context that are centuries old, ingrained in India. And I think we forget from the perspective here just how fast has been the revolution in attitudes here, socially and everything else. It's taken around, I mean, not so much as women, because it wasn't quite so deeply embedded in our culture in the way that in parallel in India. But go to an example I can relate to around sexuality. 50 years ago, gay sex was criminal. I got my dates right yesterday. And we've now got to, over 50 years, we've seen the law completely changed and almost indeed complete equality established under the law, apart from some rather minor points on pension law. And more importantly, we've seen a complete change of cultural attitudes and social attitudes in the country, where if people now, the worst thing people could do to me is have a go at me about my sexuality. That would be, certainly in terms of politically across, if someone insulted me across the chamber, they would be in serious professional and reputational trouble. That would not have been the case 20 years ago. And so you just look at that journey that we've made over those issues over 50 years, and then you're looking at an old establishment member of an old profession in a culture where they are only on the beginning of that journey. And whilst the attitudes expressed are outrageous and examples should be made of someone in a profession like that, because that's all part of the cultural change that needs to be made. So you raising it and making a fuss of it and it being a fuss made of it in India and everything else is all part of the learning process.
They had a woman prime minister before we did. I mean, that's the bit that I find really strange. It isn't, in many respects, it isn't such a backward nation in so many respects in relation to some extent to wealth and trade and education for elites, including women.
Well, perhaps let's wait and see when they elect a woman prime minister who is not related to somebody or not married to somebody who has actually gone there on her own basis. Well, it may be, but exactly the point that we made about Hillary Clinton, that she wouldn't have got there if she hadn't been married to Bill. I mean, the fact that she's, and she's got to, but clearly that was a rather amazing marriage of two extraordinarily talented people. There's no doubt that she's very properly going to have a pretty decent tilt at becoming the next president entirely on her own merits, and she wouldn't survive the process if she wasn't talented enough to run that campaign. However, it would be nice if it was, I think Margaret Thatcher's a rather more, in that sense, a rather more pioneering, impressive role model, because she didn't get it because Dennis perhaps gave her the money to be able to actually run it.
Can I just pick up on something else you said, Crispin? I mean, I think the sexuality example is a really, really interesting one, because so much has changed in such a short period here. And one of the cases I always try to cite when we're having an argument about the Human Rights Act is the case of the military case. The fact that in this country, not very long ago, you were subject to summary dismissal from the services if you were gay, whatever your record, whatever the circumstances. And that's a very sharp reminder of where we were not so long ago. But we're here talking about
behind the summary dismissals. You were dismissed, but behind that sat a potential court martial.
Yes.
It wasn't offence.
Yeah.
And the military police were, frankly, were. To say unsympathetic would probably be some element of English understatement, as people would see the way they'd be turned over if they were suspected.
Yeah, but I mean, just broadening this out to the Commonwealth, there's an organisation called the Human Dignity Trust, which is now looking to challenge the equivalent provisions which are in most of the laws of the Commonwealth, which are straightforward criminal provisions, making homosexuality a criminal offence, with very long sentences that creates a culture of discrimination and violence, and leads to people being prosecuted. And just stepping, you may say, well, how is it that so many Commonwealth countries have got these provisions? And if you looked at their legislation, you'd see that nearly all of their laws look pretty much the same, whichever Commonwealth country you go to. And the reason they've got them is that when we colonised countries, we did a number of things, but we absolutely insisted they take our criminal law. We dumped our criminal law on every country that we colonised.
Like toxic waste.
So you'd arrive, you put the flag in, and whatever else you did, you would download the entire criminal law of England and Wales into that country. That's why pretty well every Commonwealth country has got a version of what were then our criminal laws. That's why homosexuals criminalised in Jamaica, in Nigeria, in Uganda, because we did it. We required that as one of the rules of colonisation. I mean, I first came across this when I did a lot of work on the death penalty, because the reason they hang people by the gallows in Commonwealth countries, particularly in the Caribbean and Africa, is because that's what we did here. And we said, you have our criminal law, so for murder, you must hang everybody now. That's what we do in London. Therefore, you'll do it in Kingston in Jamaica, you'll do it in Trinidad. And that's all part of the legacy. And so the Human Dignity Trust, much like the campaigns against death penalty, is now trying to bring cases in various Commonwealth countries to challenge the provisions that criminalise homosexuality. But it's part of the history and legacy.
And how effective is the Commonwealth as a mechanism, as a family of nations, at tackling some of these residual human rights problems in the territories? Really?
In terms of sort of hard change, not really. But but in terms of, it provides a forum to, and this was the story I was going to tell about me, about trying to use part of the institutions of the Commonwealth, principally also the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, who are sponsors of this event, and I suppose it's my story around these issues and the Commonwealth. I came out age 50. I'd been a minister for 4 months. So it got splashed over the front pages here. About 2 years after that, Mr. Cameron then relieved me of my responsibilities as Prisons Minister, and the diary was then agreeably empty. And I then decided that I would then take from September that the reshuffle happened. I would then take until Christmas to work out exactly how I was going to re-engage with parliamentary activities, which causes I would take up. and into my inbox dropped an email from this outfit called the Kaleidoscope Trust, who an NGO who were then newly set up, whose intention was to promote LGBT rights internationally. And I then looked at that and thought, this is actually one of the right things for me to engage with and put my energies into outside the constituency of Reigate. If you go back and look at my speaking and voting record since I got elected in 1997, it was not. It stands some criticism from people who would. It's not perfect if one looks at it from the LGBT rights perspective. I can't remember actually if I was voting in the wrong direction, in the sense it was almost certainly my party's call, and my own realisation of who I was and coming to terms with myself. Some of it started in the chamber of the House of Commons, when like a moth to the flame, thinking I understood these things because perhaps I knew an inner truth, but I thought I had made a choice about my sexuality, and which is, as a 18-year-old wanting, a son of a soldier, wanting to go into the army and thinking about politics in the end, and having no one to talk to about me. The only thing I understood about myself was that these things, girls, were just frightfully difficult. And it took me an inordinate, but boys were certainly not allowed, certainly in a homophobic school and in a family environment else, and there was no one to talk to about what I might do or anything else. So it took me 6 years, and eventually I discovered girls, and that all seemed fine. I was like, that's a huge deal, I've done that. And that all seems to work, it's quite fun. And there was no alternative, and then I got married at age 30 as I left the army, and my political career had begun at that stage, and I was an adopted candidate and the rest. And but I knew there was a truth about myself inside. Actually, in the chamber of the House of Commons, we were debating the equalisation of the age of consent in 1998. And like a moth to the flame, I got drawn into that debate. And I remember in the course of a speech I made where I was I was speaking around an amendment about protecting 16 and 17-year-old boys from those over the age of 21. Unconscious that if I was making an argument, I could have made an argument about boys and girls, which would have been valid. But making an argument just about boys was wholly invalid. That didn't occur to me at the time. And I remember being intervened on by Ben Bradshaw when I used the term that I had made a choice, or you made a choice, because of course that's what I had. I had none. And I got a derisive intervention back from him that it's not a choice. I remember sitting down at the end of that speech, then just to myself, no, it's not a choice, is it? And so I went through this journey of waking up to myself. And then when I came out at age 50 and then being presented with the opportunity to help the Kaleidoscope Trust, I then thought I owed my freedom to make that choice at age 50 to a lot of awfully brave people who had given up their opportunities for careers if they had wanted to be in the army or in politics or anything else in a conventional sense, who had actually come to terms with themselves very much earlier, but then made huge sacrifices in order to, in the UK, in order to advance the case of equality around sexuality. A contest from which I was notably absent. So I then saw the Kaleidoscope Trust as the opportunity then to do a bit of payback, to then go and support the people in countries in the Commonwealth who were perhaps in positions that are analogous to those who would have been in the UK in the 50s, 60s and 70s as they were fighting to advance the cause of equality here in the UK. And so I got engaged with the Kaleidoscope Trust, and they were in the process of doing some work, leading up to the Commonwealth Heads of Government Conference in October 2013, I think the work was being done. And so I remember coming here then to speak to, in this room, give a paper on LGBT rights in the Commonwealth. That's from March, April 2013, and done a review of the situation in the Commonwealth. And then, in advance of the Kaleidoscope Trust, then producing a kind of comprehensive, proper report before the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting to try and advance the agenda with heads of government. And then in parallel to that, in 2014, I then thought then on the back of that work in 2013, what I could do is actually go and talk to African and Caribbean parliamentarians who are presiding over these laws that are still in place, in some countries being enforced, in some countries the laws being made, proposals to make the laws even harsher in terms of the penalties against gay people, and there are areas where the laws are on the statute book but not enforced. There's a whole pattern of where these laws are. But I thought the contribution I could make is actually go and talk to my opposite numbers and really just tell my story, and then through that prism of my story tell the UK story, and essentially be trying to say to them, look, you can either be ahead of the curve or behind it, and this is what is going to happen in terms of people waking up to the fact that there are just as many gay people in Nigeria as there are in the
How did that go down?
as in the UK.
How was that? I mean,
in private, fine. And I did a bilateral visit to Kenya, and I went to see the Speaker of the Kenyan Parliament, and and I went to see 5 members of the Kenyan Parliament who sat on their Human Rights Committee, and the anxiety then was there were a small political party, 3 MPs, anxious to try and make a name for itself, so it was feeding off a sort of evangelical Christian hatred of gays that is so present in so many of the frankly nasty little churches that kick around in that part of the world, preaching in a frankly what I would regard as the most un-Christian way imaginable, hatred for other people, but that's just an aside. We get into my prejudices about religion and the rest, but that's the political environment they're operating in. So if you so they could get some serious political attention for a small party by I think there was going to be a death penalty for involved in this legislation around gay sex and life sentences for some people and others. So there was a big anxiety then not to follow the Ugandan example and try and make, as far as the Kenyan policymakers were concerned, to try and make sure this didn't surface. And you could have and I was also then meeting the LGBT activists in Kenya to try and put them in touch with the MPs who were going to be prepared to talk to them. The MPs, of course, were extremely anxious that these conversations were not public in any way. So try and give them the reassurance that they were not going to be outed, as it were, for having a temerity to actually speak to LGBT activists, and then try and make some of the links with the Kenyan Human Rights Commission, where there were some members of it who were very sympathetic and trying to protect the interests of LGBT people in Kenya. So just use the opportunity that being an MP and going on a visit like that has, then to make those links. I then went to answer your question, I then went to the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association Parliamentary Conference in Cameroon, and there just had the conversations, some in private, some in public session, and there were 2 public sessions I spoke in, one where there was quite sympathetic support for the position I was putting forward, and then another where I wasn't the speaker, I was putting questions to, there was a Cameroonian MP who was making a proposition, and to say he was dismissive would, and he got an easy laugh from about half the hall. But so in public there was not much progress. In private we've had discussions with people, even including the Speaker of the Ugandan Parliament, who had led the charge on making the law worse in Uganda when she was publicly upbraided at an IPU conference by the Canadian foreign minister, and her attitude to being given a public dressing down was, well, I'm sitting over a parliament where the vast majority of people want to make the law much harsher for gay people, and if you're going to give me a public bollocking, then I'm going to let the law go through because that's what the MPs want. And that's in effect what happened in Uganda. It was just very badly handled.
Right. So that pressure, that moral pressure from the Canadian parliamentarian actually made things worse.
By the way it was done, it made it worse. Now, and of course, Uganda then began to get itself into a spiral downwards. So Museveni, in any bilateral conversation he was having with a Western leader, would always find gay rights sat on the list that the Western leader would be obviously the community, either whichever country it was, the LGBT rights lobby would be saying, have you raised this with Museveni? So they would obviously have to say yes. And so Museveni was saying, I've just had it with hearing about it. All I hear about is gays the whole time. And he just wants it as an issue to go away. So there is an effect then of making sure that these things are on the agenda of Western leaders, the bilaterals. And then Museveni goes off to Texas on a visit, and the first two hotels he's arriving in say, you're not coming here. And refuse to have him because of the attitude on LGBT rights in Uganda. So there is ways in which you can the wider community can apply pressure. But within Uganda, you've got to take a lead from what the Ugandan activists are telling you within Uganda. So what you can do as to how effective the pressure would be, because in lots of these countries, you've got people who've been murdered. In Jamaica,
you don't want to make it worse.
In Jamaica, I'm in the case with the Human Dignity Trust to challenge the law there, and our client had to leave Jamaica once it became known that he was the claimant in the case for fear of death. So it's a very, very real thing. But just taking, this public-private dialogue is really important, and we must all be plugged into that dialogue. And one of the concerns I've got, I think the Commonwealth can act as a brake, but it can also act as a force for good, as a collective of countries. So sometimes there's the tendency to huddle together to protect something which none of us would accept, some of these laws, etc. This is the way it's done in some Commonwealth countries. You can see huddles of Caribbean countries and huddles of African countries sort of clinging to each other.
Well, what
on
about
the basis
death
we
penalty?
want. And this is what they did on the death penalty. But one of the ways to cut through the death penalty was the very clear stance that our Foreign Office took, for example, on it, making it one of those symbolic human rights issues that was at the centre of our foreign policy. And what that meant in practice was that if you were in any of the Caribbean countries and you wanted Foreign Office help, then you were going to have a discussion about death penalty and about human rights. And it might be behind the scenes, but it was a very real discussion. So in very many countries, there is a real need for help in properly setting up the police, the prosecutors and the courts, because they don't operate in the way that is best for everybody in those countries. And there's very often a dialogue and collective work with our Foreign Office in that, and that's an ideal situation in which pressure can be brought to bear on those countries to comply with human rights obligations. One of my big concerns in recent years is that we are backsliding on this approach to human rights. William Hague was very, very good. Almost every time he spoke about foreign policy, he always brought human rights and rule of law and said this is they sort of circle around the same themes. That seems to be becoming more and more distant. So the commitment to get rid of the death penalty has been taken out of the Foreign Office main theme and policy. It's not there anymore. We have openly been talking in this country about withdrawing from the European Convention on Human Rights. Now, whatever your private views about the piece of legislation here called the Human Rights Act, this is a big deal across the world. The idea that the UK would withdraw from a major international human rights instrument that it drafted and signed after is really. In Trinidad, we were fighting with them to stay within the inter-American human rights system because of the death penalty, they wanted out. And they would absolutely, and Bahamas as well, and Barbados, they would absolutely point to the UK to say, well, you keep telling us not to get out and to stay within this sort of umbrella of human rights protection. And you yourselves now are talking about getting out of the European one because you can't live with it. And it would be like a set of dominoes, I think, through the Commonwealth if we weren't careful in terms of the message of pulling out of international human rights treaties. I think there's backsliding on the foreign policy. We've got to be very careful.
We are a fairly intimate group, so I wonder if anybody would like to ask something or say something and pretend they're asking something. That's usually the best way. Is anyone who'd like to make a point?
It's not like the 1922 committee where the first 3 people to speak are all definitively mad.
These insights that we're getting from you today. I slipped something in his coffee earlier, and we're getting all of these wonderful, wonderful stories and secrets. Yes.
I think both panellists have done a lot of work with human rights defenders, so I wondered whether they could talk about the role of parliamentarians in supporting them.
Yes. I mean, you sort of began to touch on it in your relationship with the Kaleidoscope Trust and you with the Human Dignity Trust. Do you want to develop that?
Yeah, so in Kenya, which a visit I made just over a year ago, then I went to see LGBT rights activists that were known to the Kaleidoscope Trust and who the Kaleidoscope Trust were supporting directly, and to get their stories and obviously to give them some at least moral support and the prospect of a connection into the UK. The High Commission were terrific in setting up a sort of round-table discussion with which they brought the human rights and used my visit then to bring members of the Kenya Human Rights Commission along with some of these LGBT activists and me, and then in order to enable the linkages to be made for the discussions then to be had. And then I went to see MPs on the Human Rights Committee in the Parliament, and also then had a meeting with the Speaker of the Kenyan Parliament, obviously all around the legislation that was being kicked around in the sort of first stages of drafting, and then trying to put it on. It looks as though the process as though the Speaker was in a position to make sure this never saw the light of day, just in terms of process, and really raising his consciousness with did they really want to go in the same place as Uganda, and then have a very public controversy causing all sorts of difficulty for the executive, and it obviously be infinitely better for the reputation of Kenya if this stuff was just if it could be kept out of the public realm. And that was really the view of the LGBT activists there as well, is that what they wanted was then the opportunity to be able to engage privately with lawmakers and policymakers, so that they could get, if you like, to understand the position. And if you have, someone like me then has that one-on-one conversation with a fellow parliamentarian, it's pretty tough for them to turn around to me and say that somehow my own story is invalid. And then if I can then relate my story and the fact that it took me so long to come out and everything else, to the social conditions into which I grew up.
Yeah.
And it was saying to them, you've got to accept that there is somewhere between 5 and 10% of your population who are gay. It is not a choice, and you owe them a duty to protect their rights, just as you owe a duty to everybody else. And what are you going to do about it?
So when you do this, when you have these one-on-one conversations with your fellow parliamentarians from around the Commonwealth, do you always feel, or nearly always feel, that you're treated with some appropriate respect, or do you get direct abuse on occasion?
No, not like that. Never in a either meeting with. I mean, I met the 5 Kenyan members of the Human Rights Commission together, and you could see there was a certain amount of nervousness that one of them might dog the other one in terms of if they went public about what their views what their views might be. So there was a certain amount of caginess, but certainly, to me, none of them challenged my, if in a sense, my story or my perspective. They then had a proper, mature conversation about and so the fact of my story and the fact of how society had changed in the UK, and these are laws which the United Kingdom had forced on largely on the Commonwealth, as Keir has pointed out. So this was not some, what I was saying to them, I'm not asking you to do something un-African. And Uganda generally pointing out that the last king of Uganda had a harem, and it certainly wasn't female.
You're saying shed some imperial
and say actually what we exactly want to get rid of is a British hangover.
But just going back to the question about human rights defenders, I mean, this is an important question because quite often they are exposed and taking risks. They're usually thin on the ground. We're talking about quite big countries, but the human rights defenders will be a mere handful of individuals, so they feel very vulnerable. They are in public, the public attention on them because of the work they're trying to do. And they need solidarity, and I think one of the good things about Commonwealth organisations is an ability across different countries to provide that solidarity. Because otherwise there isn't the shared experience, there isn't the sense of coming together. And certainly in all the countries where we were fighting initially, I mean, I'm doing stuff now with Human Dignity Trust, but I did probably 20 years on the death penalty, which is a less, the public do divide on the death penalty, but not in the same way they do on homosexuality, in the sense of what they want to do to people who support one cause or the other. But even there was a real concern about how exposed they were going to be for fighting the death penalty, and so that solidarity is really important. And we, again, it's a question of how we behave ourselves. One thing I disliked about David Blunkett when he was the Home Secretary was that in this country he made it his business to attack human rights lawyers as a group. That there was something that wasn't legitimate.
Well, it was
about
judges
being
too. It was judges too, to be fair.
and you know, in other words, these are a group of people who are to be despised, who are up to no good, and that is something that we have to be very, very careful about across the world.
No, it's a good point, isn't it? Because here, I mean, it's almost embarrassing to call myself a human rights defender, because the worst thing that's ever going to happen to me is a little bit of name calling in the press or on the internet. But I haven't actually, until you mentioned it just now, seen the link between that and people elsewhere who are actually putting their lives on the line. And if, for example, a British Prime Minister talks about unelected judges in Britain or in Strasbourg, how will that make judges in less stable democracies feel when they're being attacked with more chilling potential elsewhere? Does somebody else have a point? Yes, sir.
Just, I'm talking about obviously the UK. A quick comment on the Keir mentioned about the heritage, the cop-out that a lot of Commonwealth countries use about, oh, well, it's your laws, we're just doing what you used to do. South Africa actually has got a very kaleidoscope constitution, and is quite good at standing up in public and berating its African colleagues about the issues of gay rights. And perhaps we should make more of that, and Botswana is in the same boat. There are other issues on the death penalty. I mean, how do parliamentarians here balance the issue of a Christian on death row in Pakistan, where quiet diplomacy is gradually moving that individual towards the exit gate, when there's a question in the House, or comments in the House, about the awfulness of human rights in Pakistan, which then is effectively putting Pakistan in the dock publicly in the UK and undoes all the diplomatic work that's been done. I mean, how do you balance that? Or how do you say to MPs that you should be doing that?
Well, can I just answer two bits of your question? Because the first was about some countries using in their defence the fact that these laws were imposed on. There's a little vignette, a little story in there, which is really, really interesting. As each of the Commonwealth countries fought for and eventually got their independence, where there wasn't any real violence. It was done by way of constitutional conferences, one in the country and one usually in London. And the first country up to go through the process in any substance was Nigeria. And in Nigeria, at that conference, various representatives of various communities said, we have minority rights issues here, we have real potential for human rights abuse, we're very worried about discrimination. And it was, some bright spark and said, well, in the Constitution you obviously need a human rights provision that is enforceable in the Constitution. So they said, well, I don't know what that looks like. So, well, give us 5 minutes. They cut and pasted the European Convention of Human Rights, put in the word Nigeria and dumped it in the Constitution. Literally, if you go to the Nigerian Constitution, you will see the European Convention, almost word for word, set out in exactly the same words, exactly the same order. What happened next, a few months later, was the Jamaican conference was on. And they too said, well, look, we think there might be human rights. I said, I'll tell you what, we've got one here that we used in Nigeria. So they then copied the Nigerian constitution, substituted it in Jamaica. And if you now get the constitutions of most Commonwealth countries and lay them out on the table, they are almost word for word the same. And they've nearly all got the European Convention written into them. So the height of the period when we were saying you don't need to entrench the European Convention, it's not necessary in a common law country. We were busy cutting and pasting it into the constitution of every single Commonwealth. It's a fantastic
story.
But and there's a but on this because it's really important. Brits being Brits, we drafted with these countries' constitution that said, here's your constitutional human rights provision, you can challenge any law against this constitution, and it's struck down. They're quite powerful constitutions in that sense, if it's incompatible with the human rights provision. But only from the day of independence onwards. Any law that was in existence on the day of it. So you can't challenge the old colonial laws. You can. This is to stop you people passing laws which might breach human rights.
But the old
it's
stuff
not
that
to
we
stop
left
you challenging the laws that we put in place. And that clause, it's in nearly all the constitutions, the most pernicious, cruel savings clause that is there in most countries forever until it's amended. So it is actually also very difficult to challenge using those what otherwise would be quite dynamic constitution, which is why the death penalty is why challenging homosexuality in Jamaica is a problem. Actually establishing that it's inhuman to criminalise and send people to prison for very long periods because their sexuality is easy. Establishing that hanging everybody who's convicted of murder is inhuman is easy. Every single court that's ever decided those issues has always decided the same way. It just can't be enforced in the Commonwealth because in London conferences we didn't think it appropriate to have our colonial laws challenged. It's a really interesting
But what about
story.
What about the point about the tension between public, unequivocal public, moral, political commitment to human rights and the quiet diplomacy, and that perennial tension between the two, and the responsibilities that you may and may not feel on this as parliamentarians?
Today's the day President Sisi arrives in London. These are very difficult judgments to make. There's an element which on the LGBT stuff, the advices and the kind of the accepted practices is take your lead from the LGBT activists
on the ground,
on the ground as to whether they want a fuss made, make a fuss. If they don't want a fuss made, don't. And sometimes I wonder whether that's right or not, just in terms of what the policy outcome would be. Because you can get a fuss made over by accident, and which you would not have done if you had been able to control the circumstances. And then you find it works, which is what happened in Malawi. Courtesy of WikiLeaks, the British High Commissioner's private commentary on a homophobic rant by the then Malawian president was then published. The Malawians ordered the British High Commissioner home, and we then responded by effectively saying, well, if you think you're going to have an aid budget going to the Malawi government, you can think again. And the reaction in Malawi was not one of nationalist indignation at the colonial British. It was looking at the president and saying, you half-wit. look what the damage you've just caused to our country. And he was then, I think he may then have died in office, but he was then replaced by a president who was Prime Minister, who was Joyce Banda, who was much more sympathetic on this issue, and then trying to find a way to change the legislation. And certainly the atmosphere changed significantly, but also she was then able to give an instruction to prosecutors and police: this law is not going to be enforced. And so the whole climate in Malawi improved significantly. But it was an accident. There was no few. I think if you've taken your lead from the activists on the ground, they may not have been absolutely wild about there being a public row in that way. So it's sometimes difficult to be completely right about this. But it's and I've got interviews about being asked. I'm asked to do interviews about CC's visit. I was very critical of what happened in 2013. I think I was the first European politician to go into Rab al Adawiya, the demonstrations in Cairo after President Morsi was overthrown by the revolution, the second revolution there. I couldn't use the word coup, but that sense seemed to be lining up with the Brotherhood version of events. It's how do you deal with the fact we have to do business with a country the size and importance of Egypt, with the fact that that government came to power having cleared those squares 2 weeks after I was there, killing thousands of people in the process, and have now got 40,000 people in prison. And some of those I met an American citizen, American Egyptian, who'd been swept up in that, had been 400 days in custody, being tortured and everything else, who came to talk to me and other people here about the account of what had happened to him.
So look, there's just a few minutes left. Could I maybe ask each of you to just leave us with a final thought? So a final thought maybe on a priority, a realistic priority expectation to play for in terms of human rights in the Commonwealth in the next few years, something that you think is potentially really achievable in terms of making progress?
I think having human rights as a sort of term of any engagement, agreement, etc. across Commonwealth countries is really, really important, because in the end that makes a real difference. If people understand they're the terms upon which we do business, and they're the terms upon which other countries should do business with each other, it gives real effect to what can otherwise be human rights norms, standards which are written into law but never ever given any practical application.
It's quite difficult, it's particularly certainly around the LGBT stuff, which is then can be used as a I hope that all the countries are on a journey of actually getting to equality, but you've got an awful lot of countries, particularly in Africa and the Caribbean, very strong religious, sort of fundamentalist Christian religious teaching, very quite strong church attendance and the rest. So these attitudes are there, very present in society, and they're popular. And so for the politicians, these are easy runs to make, which is why it was easy to whip this up in Uganda. And the CPA, it's a rather eye-opener for me to go to the CPA Parliamentary Conference and see this split inside the Commonwealth between countries who would then see our attitudes towards human rights as frankly, as a piece of colonial lecturing as to how they should run their countries, and then almost the sort of hostility around the attitudes and the positions we were taking to try and advance a human rights agenda. They would see it in that sense as hostile in that sense. And so I think you've just got to use the instruments at your disposal to put pressure on the executive, on the leadership, to continue to try and educate parliamentarians that they've got to get out ahead of they've got to be brave enough to get out ahead of their population. They've got to lead on these issues. And then you've got to give support to the human rights activists in the countries concerned. First of all, give them the sense of solidarity, that they're not alone, that there's a big global community that's there to support them both morally and practically, with obviously money and resources and good lawyers through the Human Dignity Trust and the rest to fight their cases. And it's then horses for courses on whatever the human rights issue is in the country concerned, about how best to advance human rights in that country, consistent with what's going to work politically, so to a degree consistent with the culture and values of that country. And sometimes, of course, these things you are challenging the values and culture of that country, because you have to look at Saudi Arabia, and there are things about it's obviously outside the Commonwealth, but Pakistan would be a better example of Sharia law that are plainly make life pretty uncomfortable around the whole issue of individual human rights.
Well, thank you. Well, the hour is up. I have to say that I have rarely felt more privileged to listen to two politicians speak. For that, it really, really was very, very thoughtful, at times poignant, and ultimately, I think, optimistic. So please join me in thanking Crispin.